I mean this in the nicest way possible. Speak the fuck up when you have an issue. This is I Mean This in the Nicest Way Possible, and I'm your host, Richard Armand Mills. Let me be very clear right away. This is not about being rude. It's not about being aggressive. It's not about turning every minor inconvenience into a confrontation or becoming the person who makes everyone else uncomfortable on principle. This is about self-respect. This is about standards. This is about boundaries that don't require your silence to survive. Because there is a difference, a big one, between being emotionally mature and being quietly shortchanged. And a lot of us are confusing the two. You can be confident and still let things slide. You can be self-aware and still suppress your needs. You can be calm, regulated, and nice while consistently swallowing discomfort you shouldn't have to carry. Most people don't stay silent because they don't notice something's wrong. They stay silent because they don't want to be that person. They don't want to cause inconvenience. They don't want to seem dramatic. They don't want to look difficult. They don't want to make things awkward. So they tell themselves, it's fine. It's not worth it. I'll let it go. But silence has a cost, and almost always you pay it later. Speaking up isn't about control. It's about congruence. Because when something feels off and you don't say it, your body doesn't just move on. It keeps the score. Resentment starts to accumulate. Self-respect erodes quietly. And eventually, that swallowed frustration comes out sideways. As irritation, exhaustion, delayed anger, or a sudden snap that feels bigger than the moment. And here's the part that really matters right now. We're living in a moment where standards are being lowered, while costs keep rising. Prices are higher. Quality is worse. Service is thinner. Boundaries are blurrier. And silence increasingly benefits systems, not individuals. When you don't speak up, companies save money. When you don't speak up, workplaces keep pushing. When you don't speak up, relationships stay comfortable for everyone else at your expense. And I say this as someone who did not think of himself as a pushover. I wouldn't describe myself as someone who lets people walk all over me. I'm not conflict phobic, far from it. I'm not unaware. And yet I can see how I let many small moments slide because it felt easier in the moment. Consumer situations where I swallowed my dissatisfaction because I didn't want to be a problem. Work environments where boundaries didn't disappear overnight. They slowly dissolved because I kept being easy instead of clear. Moments where I told myself, it's fine, I don't have the energy for this. And then wondered later why I felt so irritated or small or angry with myself. That pattern always looked the same. It's easier to let it go. Turns into, why am I still thinking about this? Which turns into, why do I feel so resentful? Because letting it go doesn't mean releasing it. Most of the time, it just means storing it. And that's what this episode is really about. Not being combative, not demanding perfection, not policing every interaction, but learning how to advocate for yourself without abandoning yourself in the process. The question is whether you're willing to speak the fuck up or keep paying for silence you didn't actually choose. Let's start with the real reason why most people don't speak up, and it's not weakness. It's conditioning. A lot of silence is disguised as being chill, easygoing, low maintenance, unbothered. We tell ourselves we're being emotionally mature, when in reality, we're just avoiding friction. Conflict avoidance has been rebranded as good vibes. But avoiding conflict doesn't mean you're regulated. It usually means you're prioritizing short-term comfort over long-term clarity. According to Psychology Today, many people suppress concerns not because they don't matter, but because they overestimate the social risk of speaking up. We imagine judgment, rejection, escalation, or being labeled difficult, even when the issue itself is reasonable. So instead of addressing the problem, we manage the anxiety around how we might be perceived. And that's the first trap. We don't ask ourselves, is this wrong? We ask ourselves, how will this make me look? And that fear shows up everywhere. At restaurants, when your order is wrong, but you don't want to inconvenience the server. With customer service, when you've been clearly shortchanged, but don't want to make a fuss. In relationships, when something keeps bothering you, but you don't want to seem dramatic. And at work, when boundaries blur, but you don't want to be seen as ungrateful, are hard to manage. And that brings us to authority conditioning. Most of us were taught, explicitly or implicitly, that authority figures set the rules. Bosses, systems, companies, policies, institutions. So when something feels off, our instinct isn't to question it, it's to accommodate it. We learn early that being agreeable keeps things smooth, that pushing back can have consequences, that asking for what you're entitled to might cost you socially or professionally. According to leadership and communication research summarized by Crucial Learning, people often stay silent in the face of issues not because they lack confidence, but because they fear the secondary consequences: retaliation, damaged relationships, or being perceived as problematic, more than they value immediate resolution. So we comply, we tolerate, we adapt, and we call it professionalism, or politeness, or emotional intelligence. But here's the lie sitting underneath all of that. We've been taught that discomfort equals harm, that if something feels awkward, tense, or unpleasant, it must be wrong to address it. But discomfort isn't danger, it's data. Discomfort is often the nervous system reacting to novelty, not actual threat. And when we avoid that momentary unease, we don't make the problem disappear. We just internalize it. That's why silence feels fine at first and corrosive later. Because when you repeatedly override your own signals to keep the peace, your body doesn't interpret that as maturity. It interprets it as self-betrayal. And over time, that builds resentment, not towards the situation, but toward yourself. So if you've ever thought, why am I so irritated about this later? Or why does this still bother me? Or why do I feel smaller every time I let this slide? It's because the issue wasn't resolved. It was postponed and stored. And the longer something stays unspoken, the heavier it gets. Which is why speaking up early, calmly, clearly, and respectfully is almost always less disruptive than waiting until the pressure leaks out sideways. Here's the part most people underestimate. When you don't speak up, it doesn't just disappear. It goes somewhere. A lot of us tell ourselves we're letting it go, that we're being mature, that we're choosing peace. But what we're actually doing is holding it in, and the body keeps track. According to research summarized by Very Well Mind, emotional suppression activates the body's stress response. When you consistently push down frustration, disappointment, or anger, your nervous system doesn't read that as calm. It reads it as unresolved threat. Stress hormones stay elevated. Tension lingers. The body remains on alert. That's why silence doesn't feel neutral. It feels heavy. Unspoken issues tend to show up as rumination, replaying conversations in your head, as irritability, snapping over small things that aren't actually the problem, as delayed anger, resentment surfacing days, weeks, or months later, often in the wrong moment with the wrong person. And this is where people get confused. They think, I didn't say anything, so why am I still upset? Because letting it go isn't the same as releasing it. Releasing something requires expression. Silencing it requires containment. And containment has a cost. Counseling research discussed by Strong Space Counseling shows that chronically holding in emotions can lead to anxiety, emotional exhaustion, lowered self-esteem, and even physical symptoms like headaches, digestive issues, and muscle tension. The body absorbs what the mouth refuses to say. That's not weakness, that's biology. Your nervous system is designed to resolve stress through completion, through acknowledgement, through naming what's wrong and restoring equilibrium. When that doesn't happen, the stress response just stays on. And over time, something subtle but dangerous starts to form. Resentment. Not explosive anger, quiet resentment. The kind that makes you withdraw. The kind that makes you cold instead of clear. the kind that erodes relationships from the inside while you're still technically being nice. And eventually, that suppressed frustration looks for an exit. It might show up as snapping at someone who didn't deserve it, as passive-aggressive comments, as self-sabotaging behavior at work, as disengagement, as burnout. Not because you're dramatic, but because the pressure had nowhere else to go. This is why speaking up early matters. Not because you need to win every interaction, not because you're owed perfection, but because unresolved emotion doesn't vanish. It metabolizes. And if you don't choose where it goes, your body will choose for you. Let's talk about one of the most normalized places people swallow their voice: being a consumer. The order is wrong. The service didn't match what was promised. And instead of addressing it, we sigh and move on because we didn't want to create a scene or be labeled that person. When you stay silent, the inconvenience doesn't disappear. It gets redistributed. Companies benefit. Systems move on. And you absorb the cost. Financially, emotionally, and psychologically. According to guidance discussed by BetterUp, chronic self-silencing in everyday interactions reinforces a pattern of devaluing your own needs. Each time you override yourself to keep things smooth, you send a subtle message inward. My discomfort matters less than maintaining ease for others. And over time, that adds up, especially now, when prices are rising and quality is quietly declining. We're paying more, expecting less, and being socially conditioned not to say anything about it. That's not politeness. That's normalization of being shortchanged. Speaking up in these moments isn't entitlement. It's self-advocacy. You're not asking for special treatment. You're asking for what was agreed upon. Psychology research summarized by Psychology Today emphasizes that assertive communication, calmly naming what's wrong and asking for correction, is associated with higher self-respect and lower long-term stress than passive acceptance. The goal isn't escalation, it's alignment. And here's what people miss. You don't feel better after staying quiet. You feel smaller. That irritation lingers. That regret shows up later as self-directed anger. That moment becomes another example your brain stores under, I should have said something. And once you notice that pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee. If you wouldn't accept being shortchanged in your paycheck, why are you accepting it in your purchases? Silence may feel easier in the moment, but it teaches the world how to treat you. Now let's talk about where silence gets rewarded at first and then quietly weaponized against you. At work. Because in professional settings, speaking up isn't just emotional, it feels risky. There's hierarchy, power imbalance, money on the line. So a lot of people learn to be agreeable instead of clear. You say yes when you mean maybe. You stay quiet when expectations expand. You absorb extra labor because you're capable, not because it was agreed to. And at first, this looks like being reliable, being flexible, being a team player. But here's where things start to slip. Boundary creep doesn't arrive dramatically. It arrives politely. A late email here. A quick thing after hours. An emotional dump disguised as collaboration. A responsibility that somehow becomes yours without discussion. And because you didn't say anything the first time, the system assumes consent. According to workplace communication research discussed by Psychology Today, people who delay asserting boundaries often experience higher levels of resentment and burnout, not because they're weak, but because clarity was postponed until frustration had already set in. That's the trap. You think you're being mature by letting it slide, but what you're actually doing is training others on how much access they get to you. And the longer you wait to speak up, the harder it feels to do it cleanly. Because now it's not one issue, it's a pattern. And when you finally say something, it comes out heavier than it needed to. Not because you're dramatic, but because you've been carrying it alone. Leadership and growth research from BetterUp highlights that assertiveness at work isn't about confrontation. It's about expectation management. Clear boundaries early reduce friction later. Silence doesn't protect harmony, it delays disruption. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Being easy to work with is not the same as being respected. Respect comes from clarity, from consistency, from signaling what's acceptable and what's not. If you're always flexible, people stop checking. If you're always accommodating, people stop asking. And if you never name the issue, resentment starts doing the talking for you. That's why so many people don't burn out from workload. They burn out from unspoken imbalance. And this is where speaking up stops being a personality trait and starts being a regulatory tool. Because expression prevents buildup. Clarity prevents corrosion. So what does that actually look like, speaking up without blowing everything up? If you want real-world examples of what it looks like to speak up without imploding your life or career, look at Cardi B and Rihanna. Cardi B is constantly framed as loud, unfiltered, and controversial, but that misses the point entirely. Her willingness to speak honestly about contracts, expectation, and respect has protected her career, not damaged it. Her authenticity isn't reactive, it's preemptive. She makes her standards visible before resentment has a chance to build. Rihanna's version is quieter, but just as firm. After Anti, she simply stopped participating in systems that didn't honor her terms. No rage, no spiral, just clarity. Different personalities, but same core skill. Neither of them confuse silence with professionalism. Speaking up isn't about being dramatic. It's about being congruent. Because when you say nothing, resentment speaks for you, and it rarely says what you actually mean. For a long time, I thought my issue with speaking up was situational. Like, sometimes I just didn't have the energy. Sometimes it wasn't worth the hassle. Sometimes I told myself I was being chill, easygoing, and emotionally mature. But when I actually looked at my life honestly, I realized it wasn't occasional. It was a pattern. I've been the easy employee more times than I should have. The reliable one. The agreeable one. The one who picked up slack without extra pay. The one who felt weird about perfectly reasonable PTO. Who tolerated blurred boundaries and unpaid emotional labor. The one who went along with after-hours expectations I didn't actually consent to. And every time I did that, I told myself it was professionalism. But what it really was silence. Silence in the name of being liked. Silence in the name of being low maintenance. Silence in the name of not rocking the boat. And here's the part I had to be honest about. That silence didn't make me noble. It made me resentful. I didn't explode right away. I didn't scream. I didn't burn bridges dramatically. But the resentment built anyway. It turned inward first, into regret. A deep, almost physical anger at myself for knowing something was wrong and still saying nothing. And eventually, that resentment came out sideways. At work, it showed up as disengagement, as a quiet rebellion, as behavior that wasn't aligned with who I actually am because I was so unhappy with what I had allowed. That's when I realized something uncomfortable but important. When you don't speak up early, you don't stay calm, you just delay the damage. The real shift for me happened when my career changed. Working for myself forced me to look back at everything I had tolerated and ask a harder question. Why did I think my discomfort was less important than everyone else's convenience? And once I saw that clearly, I couldn't unsee how that habit had bled into other areas of my life. With business, with systems, with situations where I was paying financially or emotionally and still acting like I had no right to ask for better. That's when my standard changed. Not overnight, not perfectly, but intentionally. One of the biggest mindset shifts for me was realizing that speaking up well and being aggressive are not the same thing. But a lot of people confuse them, including me, for a long time. I used to think that if I spoke up, I'd automatically be too much, difficult, problematic. So I avoided it altogether. Now, my definition is much clearer. Speaking up well, to me, is respectful, direct, and grounded. It's not theatrical. It's not hostile. It's not about winning. It's about alignment. It sounds like naming what's off without attacking the person in front of you. It sounds like stating impact instead of assigning character. It sounds like clarity instead of an apology. And just as important, it always starts politely. I genuinely believe there is never a reason to disrespect someone simply because you're uncomfortable or dissatisfied. Whether it's a friend, a coworker, a manager, or a customer service interaction, you begin from a place of basic humanity. You give the benefit of the doubt. You assume good intent. You express the concern calmly. And if the person on the other side is respectful, open, and willing to correct or adjust, congratulations. You just spoke up successfully. No drama required. But here's the part people skip. Your tone is allowed to change if boundaries are ignored. If someone becomes dismissive, defensive, or refuses to listen, that's when firmness comes in. Not cruelty, not insults, firmness. And if someone becomes nasty or combative when you name a reasonable concern, that's information. In relationships, that might mean reevaluating access. At work, it might mean documenting or escalating the situation. When being a consumer, it might mean pushing back or taking your money elsewhere. What I don't do anymore is this middle ground where I'm polite on the outside, but furious on the inside. That version of me paid too high a price for other people's comfort. Here's what helped me stay regulated while still advocating for myself practically. First, I name issues early. Not when I'm heated, not after weeks of resentment, not when I'm already emotionally compromised. Early clarity is almost always received better than delayed confrontation. And even when it isn't, it still protects me from internal buildup. Second, I frame concerns around impact, not accusation. Instead of saying things like, you always, or you never, I focus on what's happening and how it affects me. What changed? What's missing? What doesn't align? That keeps the conversation anchored in reality instead of spiraling into defensiveness. And third, I pay very close attention to how people respond. Because response tells you everything. If someone listens, adjusts, and takes responsibility, they've earned continued access to my energy. If someone minimizes, deflects, or treats my concern like an inconvenience, I take that seriously. Not emotionally, strategically. Speaking up isn't just about expressing yourself. It's also about collecting data. Instead of absorbing the cost of other people's discomfort, I let the response guide my next move. That shift alone has saved me energy, money, and self-respect. Before we close this episode, I want to give you something actionable, because awareness without action just turns into another thing you intellectually agree with and emotionally ignore. Introducing the Speak the Fuck Up Challenge. And no, this is not about going nuclear. It's about one clean act of self-respect. I want you to identify one place in your life where you've been silently tolerating something. One situation where you've said, it's not worth it, I don't want to be annoying, I'll just let it go, even though it hasn't actually gone anywhere. Now, within the next 48 hours, I want you to do one thing. Address it. Respectfully, directly, without shrinking yourself. That means naming what's off, asking for correction or clarity, saying what you need without over-explaining, and making sure to stop cushioning your words to make them easier to swallow for someone else. No long paragraphs. No self-minimizing. No rehearsing it in your head for a week and then doing nothing. One clean moment of advocacy. Because here's the truth. The longer you stay silent, the more expensive it gets. Emotionally, mentally, financially, energetically. Speaking up doesn't make you difficult. It makes you congruent. And every time you choose clarity over quiet resentment, you reinforce something powerful. I don't abandon myself to keep the peace. That's the Speak the Fuck Up Challenge. Speaking up is not aggression, and silence is not maturity. Self-respect requires expression, and boundaries don't work if they only exist in your head. If this episode stirred something in you, if you felt seen, uncomfortable, called out, or quietly relieved, that's not a problem. That's your nervous system recognizing alignment. That's the moment where self-trust gets a chance to become action. Because when you don't speak up, you don't stay neutral. You pay for it later, in resentment, in rumination, in self-betrayal, and eventually, that cost shows up somewhere else. Season 1 of the show was about knowing yourself, listening inward, rebuilding self-respect and self-trust. Season 2 is about honoring yourself in real life, in conversations, in transactions, in relationships, in moments where staying quiet feels easier, but costs you more. This is where the work gets visible, because boundaries aren't a personality trait. They're a practice. And speaking up is one of the clearest ways you tell the world and yourself, I matter here. So if you take nothing else from this episode, take this. You are not difficult for naming what's wrong. You are not dramatic for wanting what you paid for. You are not disrespectful for protecting your time, energy, or dignity. Because the kindest thing you can do is be real. Real about your discomfort, real about your needs, real about what you will no longer quietly tolerate. I'm Ram, and thanks for getting real with me today. You just finished listening to I Mean This in the Nicest Way Possible, written and produced by Richard Armand Mills.